All right, and let's take a look at the solution, and let me actually hide these controls real quick. So not too much going on in our HTML file. We just have our script tag, which loads in our JavaScript. Let's take a look at what's happening in our TypeScript. So the first thing we did is we created an interface for our user. And we did this so that we know the shape of the data that we're getting back, essentially. So that way I know what data I'm getting back from the API, so that I can tell TypeScript, here's going to be the properties that exist in that data, here's everything that's available for me to work with. So we just created an interface, so that way we knew what the data was that we're going to get back. Then we created an asynchronous function called fetch users. Since now we're using fetch is going to be working with promises, which means we're going to be doing an asynchronous operation. And as we had talked about last week, we had a couple different ways of how we can handle promises. We can chain those .then and those .catch methods, or we can use async and await alongside those try-catch blocks. So we made the function asynchronous, so that way it gives us the capability of using the await keyword. We defined our function fetch users. This is something called a generic. You'll probably come more across it on the senior side when you kind of see the less than and the greater than symbol. But in this case, what are we returning from the function?
Promise object.
Promise, but we're not returning anything, right? In theory. Do we have a return keyword?
No.
No, exactly. So we're not returning anything, which means it's a void. However, if we are still working with a promise, so that's kind of where this generic comes into play. We're saying that we are essentially working with a promise, but that promise will not be returning anything. Eventually, it is going to be a void. So whenever we're working with promises like this in our fetch functions, this is pretty much how you're going to do your return type, where you're going to do promise, and then inside of the brackets would be whatever it is that you're actually returning. So in this case, let's say I actually did return users, well, then I could do promise user, because now I'm returning a object that matched the user interface. It's mad at me right now because I'm not actually returning anything, but this is how we would be able to essentially put those together.
I have a question here.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, kind of yesterday I was like working on it, and so in the fetch you see on line 10 the HTTP JSON this link. Is this link the actual API? Is the JSON the body of the API? Like I have a many question here. So what is this fetch? Is it getting from the like this link is an actual API key? So what is this?
This is the URL. This is the URL to the API that we are engaging with.
So the actual page of the JSON is the body of the API, or is the, or
No,
the
we're
API?
not working with JSON is being sent. This is just the URL. So a server is listening for this URL, and then once a user goes to that URL, they're sending them data, which in our case, they're sending us JSON.
So this is the API, the link, right?
Yeah. Yes. Well, the API exists at that link, yes.
The API exists, but it's not the JSON. Like, well,
We're sending JSON. The server is sending JSON.
sending JSON. Okay. So when we include the link, the server respond with the JSON,
Yes.
right?
Yep.
Okay, and yeah, and this is like technically an API because I'm always confused about this subject, the API.
The API is the one that is handling the communication for us. So we communicate with an API, but the API is communicating with the server. So this is an API that we are communicating with. The server is hosting the API, and it is grabbing the actual data.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Sweet. So now that we're using await, we need to make sure that we use that try catch block. So that way we have a way of catching our errors and also trying to try our code. So the first thing we want to do is we want to make a fetch call. So whenever we use fetch, the default method is a get. So I don't need to specify any other methods. I just put directly the URL that I want to make a request to. So if we go back to the HTTP messages, right? When you did HTTP example.com or whatnot, and you have to specify a method, doing the same thing here. So by default, whenever we use fetch, it's always going to be a get call. So in that case, you just need to put the URL of whatever API or resource that you want to come in contact with in fetch from. In this case, we want to await it. So I don't want to move on to the next line until this line is finished. So I want to make sure that I've actually successfully completed my fetch call before I run this line. So that I used await. Now in this case, there's a chance where I successfully communicated with the server, but the status isn't okay. So we noticed we have those ranges, right? Like the 200 or the 300 or the 400 or the 500. So just because something may go wrong on my API call doesn't necessarily mean that I'll be getting an error back. I wouldn't necessarily get an error. So that's why we need to check to make sure that the response was actually okay. So in this case, regardless of whether the status was kind of an error or if it was good, there's going to be this okay property, and this is going to let us know essentially if our request was always successful or not with the server. So whenever we make a network call, we'll just always check to make sure that our response was okay. If it wasn't, then what we're going to do is we're going to throw an error. And since now we're the ones throwing the error, it would immediately go to this catch block right here. So we're going to check to see, hey, was the response okay? Oh, no, it wasn't. So then we'll throw an error message where it says fetch error res.status, and then that's what we're going to print out right here. So we're the ones essentially checking to make sure. There is still, if the promise rejects, then the await is still going to automatically go, and then it's going to go to the catch. But there's a chance where I get like a 400 status code, but the promise still resolved. It still successfully gave me a response back. It just wasn't the response that I wanted. It was a 400 error or it was a 500 error. So the fetch call still did its job. It successfully still made the request to the server. It just didn't give me the thing that I wanted to. So that's why I need to check to see that if it was okay. So it's not that the promise got rejected. The promise is still resolved. It just resolved with a network value that I didn't really want. So which is why I need to check to make sure that it was okay. Any questions about this?
Yeah, so in line 13, I noticed even if you delete the interface, it still output everything. It's kind of
When does TypeScript run?
runs is like first well when we compile the file. So
Yeah, so TypeScript only runs in our IDE. So if I do this, it has no impact on JavaScript.
yeah,
JavaScript doesn't even know about this. So this is not giving me any functionality. The only functionality it's giving me is TypeScript, so I know the type of what I'm actually working with. So like in our actual JavaScript file, you can see like it doesn't exist. It gets taken out because it's not valid JavaScript, it's only TypeScript.
so when you log it and console log, even if you delete the interface, it's gonna output everything, like the user, like
Well,
all the
no,
data.
if you don't console log anything, then nothing's gonna be console log.
Yeah, like even if you delete this TypeScript, it's gonna keep like the interface from line 3 to 6 and output the users, everything is gonna be outputted. So this is only to interact with the data. If you wanna get like, for example, the email from it, you can, right?
Only for TypeScript. Again, this is only
Yeah.
for TypeScript. It has no impact on how my code actually runs when it's actually running. It's just me telling TypeScript, this is what's getting returned. That's it. It has no impact on what I'm actually logging or what it actually is. It's just me telling
Mm-hmm.
TypeScript so that if I accidentally misuse it, it knows that I misused it. Has no impact on the actual code.
Yeah, okay.
Make sense?
Mm-hmm.
Sweet. So we'll check to make sure that the response was okay. Otherwise, then we throw the error. Next, we want to parse it and convert it into its form. So since we're getting JSON back, we want to parse it into what its original data structure is, which in this case is going to be an array of objects. So in this case, I want to await that as well, because I want to make sure that before I actually log them, that they have finished being parsed. So we parse the JSON response back into its original data structure. So now I'm going to have an array of objects that now match this user interface. And then that's just what we log right here as well. In this function, I'll get to you in a second, Rakaya. In this function, we're essentially doing the exact same thing, except we're just making a different call, and then we're working with a different interface. Rakaya.
So on line 12, we're doing response.json. That is the same as json.parse, and then we pass in the response object in the brackets, right?
The response and the brackets. What brackets are you talking about?
The parentheses.
Yes, yes. It's essentially like we're doing like when we're working with like local storage and how when we would grab from local storage and we parse it out, it's essentially the equivalent of what that's doing.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. Any other questions about this one?
On line 12, you parse it into object array of object because I used only user. Like I convert it to only user. Is this the equivalent to user array? No, right?
No, because then you're saying that users, so what response.json returns is that it only returns one object, but it doesn't return only one object, it returns an array of objects. So that's why we need this user array, which is why this is what I'm saying is TypeScript has no impact on a JavaScript, which is why we want to make sure that we're telling TypeScript the correct things, because the only purpose TypeScript serves is for us, is to make sure that we aren't making mistakes, that we aren't misusing things. So if I tell TypeScript the wrong type of something, well then, it's gonna think that I'm gonna constantly be misusing something.
So can I ask you another question? I know I'm keep asking you the same question. So for example, if we remove line 6 to 1, right? And if we want to interact with the data that we got it from the server, can we still, like, for example, for user, can we do like a console log user.email user0.email? Is it gonna keep?
TypeScript has no functionality on your JavaScript. In your JavaScript, so you see your HTML, right? Your HTML is loading in your JavaScript. In your JavaScript, do you see a user's interface?
No. So we can still enter. Wow.
That's exactly what I'm trying to say. Is TypeScript has no impact on JavaScript. It only runs in our IDE. It's only there to make sure that we're working with the correct type of things. Like that's literally its only job. It does not run in the browser, does not change how our code functionally does anything. It just only helps us to make sure that we're correctly working.
Yeah. And I'm sorry, I keep asking you the same question.
As long as you got it.
Yeah.
Sweet. Same, and then like I said, the next function we just did the exact same thing, except we just had a different URL that we made that we request to, and then we changed it out. In this case, Pokemon. We're getting one specific Pokemon. We can tell this by the URL since I'm doing /1. Once we introduce the projects a little later on, I'll go over how to read API documentation, and then we'll kind of go over that. But in this case, I'm just getting one individual Pokemon back. I'm obviously checking to make sure the response was okay, and then we log out that Bulbasaur. So let's open this up. Our console. Okay, so we have our first one, which is our users. So you can see this one, we made our fetch call to the JSON placeholders type code /users. And then we just logged it out. So now we got an array of users back. So we have our array of objects, and they have all that information inside the address, the company, the email, ID, name, phone, username, yada, yada, yada. And then we also have our one individual Pokemon like so. So now we can see we're getting Bulbasaur and we're getting all the information specifically related to Bulbasaur. And then just keep in mind, you can also view all your network calls from that network tab. So if they've already been made, you can see when I went here, I don't see them. So what I would have to do is I would essentially have to remake the calls. So now when I refresh the page again, then now you can see, I'll be able to see all the calls again. So just as soon as you go to the network tab, it's only going to show you requests that come after you're on that tab. So if you just want to re-see anything, you would just need to make sure. But we can see all of our requests over here. So we can see we had one request for the users right here, and it got a 200 back, which a 200 means it was successful. We can see all those other additional information, like all those headers with that date. We can see our response. So we can see this is where we actually, the response that we got back right here as well. Let's see, we got back some JSON. We can see our other one right here as well. You can see the one. So this is the one that we made to the Pokemon. We also got a 200. There was also a GET request. And then just all of the other information related to that specific request. So in our case, we only ever made GET calls. But as you move on to the senior side, you'll probably need to make different types of calls. So how could you make a different call? So the second argument of fetch. So if we look up fetch on MDN. So the second argument of fetch, where is the actual?
Is the method.
Yeah, let me go to the fetch method. MDN. Okay. Oh, I don't want to save that's my bookmarks. So we see that the second argument is options. And if we scroll down and we see options, we can see a request init object containing any custom settings that you want to apply to the request. So if we go inside of here, you can see that here are all the properties that we can set a part of that options object. The one that we're looking for is the method. So if we scroll down, we can see there's a method right here. We can see it's optional. We can see this would set the request method. And we can see right here, it says it defaults to GET. Noah?
Yeah, yeah, I asked you earlier about this. So pretty much when we hear the word API, the first thing we should think about, is it the link? Is it if like in an interview, if they ask us what is the API, is it the link you are using to fit inside Fetch? Is it the
No, the API just stands for Application Programming Interface. It is the middleman between the client and the server. The URL is just the URL, but the API is listening at that URL for your request.
oh
Yeah. Like it's again, think of the API just like a waiter. Think about the restaurant, right? You're at a table, you're ordering food. You tell your order to the waiter goes to the kitchen, tells him your order. Once the order is ready, the waiter grabs the food and brings it back to you. So the waiter is the API. It is the middleman between the client and the server.
So it's gonna be like a separate file, probably in the back end. We're gonna work in it, right?
It's a part of your server.
Uh-huh. Okay, so inside the server file, we're gonna create in the backend, probably in the future, it's gonna be like this, right? We're gonna create an API function or something like that.
So you're gonna have a server file.
Here, guys, I just want to see the example about this. So,
Okay, so you have a server file. This is where you're creating your server. You can see I connect to my database. I'm starting my Express server. I'm listening on a specific port. And you can see I have these routes. You can see /API/order. And now inside of this routes, you can see I have a /search. So now on this website, if you go to my website /API/order/search and you go there, then you're making a call to this function. This is how an API works. So you have a server, and then you just have specific parts of the URL that you're listening for. And once a user makes a call to that URL, then you run your function.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's kind of, give an idea what is happening.
Yeah, so that's where the API.
Awesome. So server is handling everything pretty much, the file.
You wouldn't have an API without a server. Your server is running
Yeah.
it.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, thank you for this example.
Yeah. But to go back to our code, so let's say we did need to change the method. In our case, we don't have to, but let's say we did. So we would have to do our second argument, and we saw the second argument was an object. And then the property, in our case, that the object was that I wanted to change was method. And then you would put in the value of whatever it is that you want. So in this case, let's say I wanted to make a post method. So then that's how I would essentially change my call to a post call rather than a get call. Is you would create your options object, you would put in your property, and you would change the value. We'll see this come into play later on, probably with like an API key. So one way that they'll have you send an API key is via headers. So they may have you do something like this. So one way that they may have you send an API key is something like this. So then now you have your URL, you've created your options object, and now you've created a header. So now, as we saw when we inspected the page, you see all these headers in our response and our request. And now we essentially created a header for our API key, and this is one way of how you would send your API key. So different APIs have different ways of how they're going to look for API keys. So we'll try to find a couple examples later on to showcase all the different ways. But this is one way of how they may have you send it, is they may have you send it as a header. Trey.
Hey, Sean, I've got two questions. So I did mine in this order. So fetch users and then fetch Pokemon. I got the results of Pokemon back first in my console. Is that because it actually finished quicker?
Yeah, are you awaiting any of them?
I awaited both of them.
You did await fetch users and
Oh,
await.
no. I did not do await down there. I just I just called it.
Yeah, so in this case, since we're not awaiting the function calls, then this is going to get run synchronously, right? So this is going to get run, and then it's going to go and it's going to run this. So then we're just subject to whatever one completes first. So then, yeah, so in that case, Pokemon server is just responding faster than the other one.
Okay. I thought that might have been the case, but I wanted to ask to make sure.
Yeah.
And then the second question kind of falls back on TypeScript again. And you may have covered this when we first started this, but will we use TypeScript as an employee, or will they have us do straight JavaScript?
Depends on the company. Some companies don't use TypeScript, some don't. As the way that the market's going, more and more companies are migrating to TypeScript. If you don't use TypeScript at your first job, I would say within 2 to 5 years, you'll most definitely be using TypeScript. So if you don't use it at your first job, you'll definitely at least be using it within the next 5 years. But most companies nowadays will probably be on TypeScript, or at least in some mixed code base, or some JavaScript or some TypeScript. But since the beautiful thing is you guys still know JavaScript, just forget the types. Just drop the types and you still write JavaScript. So that's why we taught you TypeScript, is because I'm still teaching you JavaScript by teaching you TypeScript. And it's easy.
Thank you very much.
No?
Yeah, I just want to ask you another question. So on line 12, on line 11 and 12, adding the headers. This is so the API key, some API key. This is this an instead of using the URL, or what
I'm still
actually is
using
doing?
URL. You see, I'm still fetching at the URL right here.
But why we are using the API key in this context?
Because some APIs will not let you make a request unless you include an API key. Because they want you to authenticate them yourselves. So like to prevent people from just overloading their servers, because you think about it, like it's just everyday people that are like paying for these applications. So it's like if I'm like a good Samaritan and I just created this website, I'm paying for the hosting cost. So now every single time all of you use this website, I'm paying for your request. So to like prevent bots or just people from spamming my request, I may force people to include an API key. So that way it shows you signed up on my website, I know who you are, so that way if you misuse the API, I know who you are. So that I can block you from the API, or I can like prevent you and stuff like that. It gives them more control over knowing who's actually using the resource and preventing people from just everyone accessing it.
Yeah, so the API actually is like a key to a key to a resource in a server, right? Like
The API key is you're sending the API key to the API to essentially tell the API whether or not you've authenticated yourself to be able to get the data.
yeah, wow. Okay, yeah, thank you for this explanation. It's really good. Thank you.
Yeah. So that's this is one way of how they may have you do it. Another way is they may have you do it as a query parameter. We'll go over those things in the project intro, but this is one way right here. And obviously this could be whatever they want you to name the header. This is one common way that they'll have you name the header, but the header name could change, obviously. Any more questions before we check out the quiz questions? All right, let's check out the quiz questions then. Thanks. Noah, can you tell me what does fetch return? You are muted.
So the fetch returns returns a response from the server, which could be okay or it's like an okay anyway, but with like a yeah, pretty much the returns a response from the server.
Yes and no. I would say more specifically, it returns a promise. But it's a promise that resolves to a response object. So fetch by itself returns a promise, which is why our return type has to be promise. Because in our case, fetch is still returning a promise. It's just, are we actually going to eventually be returning anything from the function or not? But fetch itself is a promise. But as long as this promise resolves, then it's going to be a response object, which will then have the okay and the status properties. But if the promise itself does not resolve, then it would reject and then go to the catch. So it wouldn't ever be the response object in that case.
Okay. So the JSON, when we say on line 16, JSON is like a property of the fit of the promise, pretty much.
No, this is specifically a property of the response object, but this response object only gets created if this promise resolves.
Okay. Yeah, thank you.
Trey, what is the default request method used by fetch?
It is the get method.
Yeah, so the get method. So by default, whenever you use fetch, you're going to be making get calls. Rukaya, how can I specify the request method when using fetch?
So we pass that as in an object as the second argument. So we put in like the method and then like we give it the property as in get, put, delete.
Yeah. Exactly. So in our fetch, we would have a second object. And then inside of that second object, we would use that property name, which in our case would be method. And then we give it a value of whatever we want it to be, post, hash, whatnot. Okay?
So Sean, in the documentation, it said you must pass an options object. What is an options object?
The options object is this, this thing that we just created right here. It's the second argument.
Why is it called an options object?
Because you're passing in options,
Mm,
I assume. I'm not sure, but I mean, it would make sense, right? I'm changing the options of my request, like I'm changing the method, I'm changing the headers. So I'm not sure, but I think that's probably why they named it that way.
Okay.
mhm. Is it option, Sean? Because we can have like many options to make it post, pull, put, right? Like this is the
That's
option.
one, but that's just the method, right? I mean, the options object consists of a lot of different things, right? So like I could be making a post call while also including an API key. And I'm not sure if there's any other properties that are very beneficial. These are pretty much.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
But it's like options, so it's like a collection of all these different options that
Yeah.
I use to change my request. And then Noah, how does fetch report errors?
Yeah, it's gonna resolve for okay anyway, but yeah, it's not gonna show any error actually. No error. It's always resolve.
No, that's not true actually. So fetch right here, fetch will reject the promise if there's a network error. So like there's an actual problem with the network. So if there's an actual network error, meaning like I was unable to make this request, then fetch is going to reject, and then which is immediately going to go to my catch right here.
Mhm.
But if the response was a 500, which in our case, we would know would be a bad response, right? The server said no because it's in the 500 range. Fetch is still going to resolve. So fetch would still resolve even if my status was a 500. However, the OK property would be set to false. So that's why we want to always make sure that we check for OK after we do our fetch call. So fetch still can reject, that promise still can reject, it will just only reject on a network error. Other than that, it will resolve, but we still want to check for that OK property to make sure that it was actually in a status range that made the request okay.
Mhm.
All right. Any final questions about this before we move on to the project intro? We'll go over making API calls in the intro as well. So we'll also go over some more fetch stuff as we kind of talked about.
Mhm. So just like another thing, so the error always is a server side, right?
No. Like a network error, right? Like if I have an internet issue, that would be a network error. So that would mean my fetch would reject. That would mean that the error is on my end. Or even like the status code, right? If a status code falls in the 400 range, that means it's a client error, which means it was an error on my part.
Mhm.
Awesome. Anything else? All right. Well, then let's go over the project intro.